Canada can thrive in a new system, but to do so, we must be ambitious. We must work at speed and scale to find new partners, to diversify our trade and attract unprecedented levels of investment in our country.
It's no secret that Prime Minister Mark Carney is looking to diversify Canada's trade.
And it's with this approach that Canada is forging a new strategic partnership with China.
And on his recent trip to China to meet with President Xi Jinping, the two countries reached what Carney called a, quote, landmark trade deal. One of the big changes is around electric vehicles. Canada will now allow almost 50,000 Chinese-manufactured EVs to be sold here at a tariff rate of 6.1%. That's a huge shift from the 100% tariffs that were in place before this announcement. This deal is being heralded by some as a way to increase EV adoption in Canada. But others see it as just another threat to Canada's auto industry. Last year, Canada's auto sector contributed $17 billion to our economy, and more than 125,000 people are directly employed in it. So losing even part of Canada's auto sector would have a significant impact on the country's economy. And of course, the industry is already struggling with tariffs from US President Donald Trump. So today, we're going to talk about this deal with China with our guest, Dimitry Anastakis. He's a professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of History and the Rotman School of Management. And his research focuses on the development of the Canadian auto industry. I'm Cheryl Sutherland, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Hi, Dimitry. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's great to be here, Cheryl.
So Prime Minister Mark Carney secured this new deal with China that does allow for some Chinese-manufactured electric vehicles to be sold in Canada starting this year. And there's been a lot of reaction from auto leaders and Ontario Premier Doug Ford that this deal could be disastrous for Canada's auto sector. But Dimitry, you're an auto sector expert, so I want to kind of start with a reality check here. What kind of impact do you think this new deal will have on Canada's car manufacturers and jobs in the auto sector more broadly?
Well, when the deal was first announced, my initial reaction was I wasn't surprised that there was some deal, but I was struck by how small the number was. Only 49,000 vehicles, it's a ramp up, eventually 70,000. It's not a huge number of vehicles in a total car market of 1.8 or 1.9 million vehicles that are sold every year in Canada. It's actually a smidgen in some ways, even if it's a big chunk of the EV sales. So the sky is not falling, and there's a lot of devil to be learned in the details here of what this looks like. But my initial reaction was like, this is a good start in some ways for Canadian consumers to get access to great EVs that are being built outside of North America, which we are not doing necessarily in terms of small cars. And it's not a huge number. So, on the manufacturing side of things, the rhetoric from Premier Ford and Unifor, they have to say these things because that's completely understandable. Mm-hmm. There's a new entrant in the market, which could have an impact, certainly down the road. But at first blush, the initial kind of year or two of this, you're not going to see a huge impact. Some Canadian consumers who are looking for EVs will get access to a few more EVs in the marketplace. But it is not a kind of wave situation where suddenly you're going to see, hundreds of thousands of Chinese vehicles suddenly coming in. It's pretty limited.
So when you say 49,000 vehicles of the 1.9 million vehicles that Canadians buy each year, that's a pretty small number because it represents about 3%. But let's talk about the car makers that might be affected here.
Well, to be clear, we have 6 manufacturers here in Ontario and in Canada. 3 or 4 of them aren't really building vehicles that would be facing direct competition from these. Then there's Toyota and Honda, which make the most of vehicles in Canada, the most passenger vehicles in Canada, and have the kinds of cars, RAV4s and CRVs that might get impacted by this new entrant, whatever they look like. So it's going to be a small fragmented segment of the passenger vehicle market that could impact primarily Toyota and Honda, because they're the ones who build the most passenger vehicles here in Canada. Most of the big three are not really in the same marketplace. And even Toyota and Honda are building, hybrids, but they're not building EVs in Canada. So it's not the same marketplace in terms of the production side of things. And in terms of the consumer side of things, certainly Honda and Toyota probably have the most to fear in terms of any erosion of market share. But it's a pretty small segment of the market. And it's one that they're not actually building in Canada, at least not yet in terms of EVs.
I take the argument that, that the EV market in Canada is quite small, so there's not like a direct competition here or like an apples to apples competition. But I guess, to play the role of the auto sector, doesn't the existence of more EVs, even if it's just 49,000 of them, doesn't this end up taking away buyers from the gas-powered car market? And, might they convince someone to buy an EV over a car with a regular internal combustion engine, also known as an ICE?
Maybe. It could be. I don't see the marketplace for people who are buying Ford F-150s or Ford 250s, which are big, heavy vehicles that are ICEs, necessarily saying, hey, I'm not going to buy a Ford. I'm going to buy a very small BYD Seal or something like that. It's a different marketplace. But, for average, ordinary consumers who are looking at a low-cost vehicle, like a CRV or something like that, or a mid-cost vehicle, they might move over to a Chinese EV. But it's not a huge number of people who are going to be affected by this. In fact, there's a real need for more consumer choice for EVs. We're limited by the vehicles that we are getting, in part because of our connection to the United States and the way that this whole thing is set up in terms of the types of cars that come into Canada.
Let's talk about what we mean when we're talking about Chinese manufactured cars. You brought up BYD, which I think people might know about, right? BYD is this huge Chinese automaker known for making cheap EVs. I think, in fact, they surpassed Tesla in EV sales in 2025, so they're a huge player. They might be coming in, but there are other car companies that make their EVs in China. So we're talking about Tesla, Volvo, and Volkswagen. So this could be a number of different cars that are coming into the Canadian market. So, what does that mean for Canadians who are shopping for cars and are looking for an EV? Like, does this trade deal with China help them? Does it mean that we're going to get cheaper cars here?
It could. So, the deal is that, it's 49,000 vehicles, ramping up to 70,000 vehicles, and at least half of those should be under $35,000. But like you say, there's a lot of questions here to be answered about exactly what kind of cars are coming in, who's coming in. And the number, 49,000, is about the target of what we were importing before the 100% tariffs were imposed by the government in tandem with the Biden administration in the United States in 2024. So, before the tariffs came in, we were getting Teslas and Volvos and Buicks and these vehicles that were made in China that were being shipped over here in the first place. So removing that tariff means that we'll probably get a similar mix of those kinds of vehicles. We'll probably get Teslas from China again, as we were getting before. Now, we may get additionally, the hope is, from the Carney perspective, that we're going to get new entrants in there. Companies like BYD. BYD is known, as you mentioned, as being the world's largest manufacturer of EVs. They surpass Tesla, and they have a huge range of vehicles, not just the really cheap EVs, but all the way up the kind of ladder of luxury. Again, the devil's in the details. With 49,000 cars coming in, how is this going to be divvied up? Is it going to be a share that each car manufacturer gets a certain percentage? There's about 20 or 25 manufacturers in China. And we also don't know, are there going to be enough vehicles being sold by one or two of these firms to actually establish dealerships in Canada, to set up a distribution network? How is this going to unfold where Canadians do have the kind of access to these new products? And the nature of this deal and the number of vehicles really point to me that, yeah, it's going to open up the car market a little bit for these new entrants, but it's more symbolic than actually practical on the ground in terms of a huge wave of choice now. Canadian consumers are going to have to be patient if they want to get Chinese EVs. This is a beachhead, but at the same time, it's being done in a pretty slow and methodical way so that the rest of the industry and the rest of the car market isn't completely overwhelmed.
So are we then likely to see Chinese car companies like BYD set up dealerships here in Canada?
It could be. We don't know what the actual mix will be. And then there's the other side of the equation here, where, part of the deal is it's not just EVs losing those tariffs in exchange for removing tariffs by the Chinese on all kinds of agricultural and food products. The other side of it was that there's a kind of implied agreement that at some point the Chinese will consider establishing some sort of manufacturing footprint in Canada. If BYD gets a significant percentage of those 49,000 vehicles, maybe that will encourage them to think about a potential joint venture or some sort of operation. Now, again, that's kind of farther in the future, and it depends on a lot of things. But I will say this much. I mean, for the Chinese manufacturers, if they do want to establish some manufacturing footprint in Canada, which I think some Canadians would really want to see happen, they got to make sure that they're actually able to sell their vehicles in the first place. You can't really put the car before the horse and say, hey, you know what? You've got to come in and build a big manufacturing facility and then hope that Canadians will buy your vehicles. This is a way to test the market. It's a way to kind of break the logjam between Canada and China on these broader questions around trade. And it does have the benefit of offering Canadians some choice in the car market. And the current state of affairs, it's not really a direct risk because none of the Canadian manufacturers are building vehicles in those segments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this sounds like right now it's a symbolic move. And in fact, BYD that does have some cheaper EVs, we might not be seeing those cheaper EVs in Canada at this moment. Perhaps they'd be sending in some of their more expensive EVs, but all is to be seen in the future.
Right. And I'll give you a historical parallel that happened in the 1980s that really does echo this to some degree. So in the 1970s and 1980s, North America was facing a similar situation in the sense that the Japanese were building a lot of vehicles really inexpensively, and they were flooding the market. The Canadian government actually put export restraints on the number of Japanese cars coming in. And what ended up happening is instead of us just getting the cheap vehicles, the Japanese went up market because they could only sell so many cars. They decided to develop brands like Acura and Infiniti and Lexus so that they could really sell expensive vehicles. Now, this deal specifically says that half of the vehicles at least are going to be inexpensive. So the Chinese might move up the value chain market. Maybe if BYD gets a share, they're going to sell some higher priced vehicles, but it's designed to make sure that the Chinese, if they do export to Canada, export inexpensive EVs, which is what the marketplace is looking for.
We'll be right back. Okay, so can we zoom out and talk about the EV industry more broadly in Canada? Because we don't currently have much of a sector here right now, but a few years ago, we were hearing about investments being made by automakers for EV plants, as well as battery makers. It does seem like the momentum has slowed down. Why is that?
Okay, there's a perception out there that the momentum has slowed down because it is rooted in reality. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, let's say if you look at the current landscape of the Canadian auto sector, there are actually two major EV battery plants. One that's already in a production in Windsor, the LG Stellantis plant, which is building batteries mostly now for home storage instead of electric vehicles. And another huge facility, a $7 billion EV battery plant in St. Thomas, Nexstar, which is a power company, which is owned by VW. Now, we are also building a few EVs in Windsor at the Stellantis plant. But like you said, a couple of years ago, it looked like we were going to be really embracing the EV revolution. Ford had stated that they were going to spend $1.8 billion to retool their Oakville plant to build 5 EVs. Honda had made an agreement with the Canadian government and had announced that they were going to spend $15 billion to build every aspect of EVs and manufacture them here. Stellantis had said that it was going to build the Jeep EV Compass in Brampton. Now, all of those investments have been delayed or postponed or canceled. And there's a reason for that. It's not us, it's them. And when I say it's them, it's Trump and the United States. You know, one of the things that happened here is in 2024, Canada agreed with the United States to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. This was a kind of classic example of how do you use tariffs to protect an infant industry. Because the North American auto industry was kind of far behind in terms of this race to catch up and develop EVs, the 100% tariffs were designed to give us some breathing room so that Ford and Stellantis and General Motors could actually develop their products without having to face offshore competition. The other side of that was that the Biden administration had developed a whole bunch of legislation and investments, the Inflation Reduction Act, in which they were spending hundreds of billions of dollars to accelerate the EV revolution.
Right. Yeah.
Well, all of that pretty much went up in flames when Trump was elected. Not only did he cut all the EV investments, get rid of any subsidies for EV production, get rid of any incentives, he also really sent the message that the EV revolution on his watch was going to be strangled in the crib.
Mm-hmm. So, Dimitry, can you spell out what the effect was when Trump rolled back all these EV incentives? Like, why did this impact the Canadian EV market?
So it's a great question because since 1965, when Canada and the United States developed what was called the Auto Pact, which was a trade treaty, which was designed to integrate the two industries and give a little bit of balance and protection for both sides of the industry so that we could maximize our economies of scale and efficiencies so that we would build, instead of Canada just building for the Canadian market or export markets, not the United States, now we would build in our car plants cars that could be sold in the United States. And that's part and parcel of why the industry is so important. And it's been pretty successful in terms of developing a Canadian car sector. Well, the Biden administration, recognizing that the world was moving towards an EV future, utilized these pieces of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, and a few other pieces of legislation to really boost that acceleration. There was about $375 billion that were aimed at building up EV factories, building up charging stations, providing direct incentives to consumers to buy cars. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Biden did amazingly in an effort to bulletproof these investments is that he put most of the money into red states or swing states. Well, nobody really took into account just how insane Trump is. And I use that word. I know it's pretty harsh, but what he did was, in deciding to cut all those subsidies and get rid of all the legislation, the auto companies themselves had already made a huge number of investments. And you're seeing the ripple effects in the Canadian sector. That's why Ford decided not to go forward with its automotive investments in Oakville. That's why Honda said, we're not going to spend the $15 billion that we were planning on spending to build a full-on supply chain network and manufacture vehicles, because the United States is turning its back on EVs. They're getting rid of the incentives, and worst of all, they're adding these tariffs, which make it so impossible to really fully utilize the integrated nature of the North American car sector. What you're seeing is a full-scale disintegration of an integrated North American auto sector that's existed since the 1960s. It's benefited Canada, but it's benefited the car companies and American consumers as well.
The other piece of auto news that has happened in the last few days is that the Globe's Stephen Chase reported that the Carney government is going to unveil legislation in February that gives preferential access to the Canadian market to foreign companies that make cars here in Canada. Can you translate that for us? What does that mean?
Sure. And, it really marks a very significant transition from the way things have been done before up until now. This plan is predicated on some sticks. For the last 40 or 50 years, the Canadian auto industry has moved away from using harsh measures to force auto manufacturers to invest in Canada and to build in Canada. One of the things that happened in North America was that we would encourage manufacturers by offering them subsidies.
Or a carrot, for example.
Carrots. Those were the carrots.
Yeah,
but the sticks were always tariffs. But in a world that was getting rid of tariffs, the sticks were usually gone. You couldn't really hammer somebody with a tariff threat if you were in a free trade agreement or part of the WTO or had a most favored nation trading regime where everybody was at the same tariff level and we were trying to reduce tariffs. Now, the one thing that people need to keep in mind is what Trump has done is illegal. All the tariffs that he opposes are in contravention of not just USMCA, the United States, Canada, Mexico agreement, which we are a party to, but the World Trade Organization rules. So, once Trump has decided, and he did decide, to basically break all the rules and say, well, we're going to impose tariffs, Well, the Canadian government is also going to start to say, well, if it's not going to just be carrots that are going to encourage manufacturers to come to Canada, maybe we impose sticks. And this is a form of stick where you say, and the deal is, and I haven't seen the details of the deal. Let me just use an example as Hyundai. So Hyundai sells 250,000 vehicles a year in Canada. That's a lot of vehicles. They don't manufacture any of their vehicles here. But the Canadian government is at a point now where it's going to say to Hyundai, you sell a lot of cars in Canada. Maybe you should manufacture some cars in Canada. Whereas Honda and Toyota, they sell a lot of cars in Canada, but they manufacture their cars in Canada. So from now on, if Honda and Toyota want to import cars to Canada, we're going to give them a lower tariff rate because they already build in Canada. If you want to get that lower tariff rate, you've got to start building in Canada too. And this really echoes previous tariff regimes, including the kind of auto-pact and pre-auto-pact tariff regime, where there was a lot more sticks kicking around in an effort to force auto manufacturers to build cars in Canada. And let me give you one great example of a stick. So in the 1980s, as I mentioned before, the Japanese were exporting a lot of cars to Canada. In an effort to lower the imports and force the Japanese to start building cars in Canada, one of the things that the Canadian government did, which was kind of power politics, is all the cars from Asia come in to Canada through the Port of Vancouver. And normally we would inspect one out of every 30 or 40 cars to make sure that they meet Canadian requirements and they're safe and all that stuff. Well, because there were so many cars coming into Canada and the Canadian government was trying to convince the Japanese to start building some of those cars here, they changed their tactics. And they said, well, we're going to start inspecting every single car that comes off the ship in the Port of Vancouver. So all these Japanese car dealers are like, hey, what's going on? You've got to stop this. Canadian government's, hey, if you guys want to be able to sell your vehicles in Canada, you got to manufacture your vehicles in Canada too. It was one stick that the Canadian government was using in an effort to kind of encourage Japanese to manufacture. We're back in that world where people can use different types of tactics because no one's following the rules anymore. So let's be nimble. Let's be a little bit more aggressive. Let's see if we can make deals with certain countries to get cars to come in. But we can also create a structure which very much encourages companies that sell cars in Canada to build cars in Canada. And I think that's what that is, very much so. And, I would be in favor of it, as I think a lot of people in the Canadian auto industry would be as well.
So, no one's following the rules anymore. You've talked about countries like the U.S. breaking the rules when it comes to these deals. I mean, this legislation doesn't break USMCA rules because it seems to only affect non-American car companies. Is that correct?
Again, the devil's in the details. We have our own agreement with the United States, the USMCA, which is an entire other kettle of fish, which could be directly impacted by the Chinese deal. It could very well be, though Trump was pretty calm about it. When he first heard about it, he said, oh, it's not a bad deal. If he can make a deal with China, that's fine. But we also know that Trump is completely irrational and he could switch on a dime and say, oh, this is the worst thing ever. We have an agreement with the United States. It's the USMCA. Now, this agreement is obviously being trod upon because the United States is about 25% tariffs on the vehicles coming back and forth or coming into the United States from Canada if they are not USMCA compliant. So, again, this is an agreement that is aimed at cars coming from outside of North America. But who knows if USMCA can't be renegotiated and there is no deal, which again is a possibility. That is a really kind of worst case scenario for Canadian car manufacturers. And it's a worst case scenario for American car manufacturers. I mean, one of the pressure points that Canadians need to realize that, they have nothing to do with here is that the American automobile industry really does need USMCA to work.
How do you think the Canada EV deal with China will affect the renegotiation of our free trade deal with the U.S. and Mexico?
So on one level, it could potentially be used as a way to blow up all of our negotiations on the broader USMCA, including the auto aspects. And the auto aspects are really the heart of the USMCA. But on a kind of more macro level, one of the things that the Americans could say is like, if you're allowing Chinese vehicles into Canada, that's fine. We're not going to allow them to come into the United States. We're also going to make it very clear that any rules going forward would prohibit any Chinese-made vehicles in Canada coming into the United States as well. So they're using their market access to kind of as a hammer to force us to do certain things. And, Mark Carney alluded to this in his speech in Davos, where he said integration is being used as a form of forced subordination. And, this was very telling to me, where the Chinese deal is a direct kind of response to that concern to get us out of that. So the Chinese EV deal could have permutations and ripple effects on USMCA that could be very localized in a way in terms of what the deal could look like, but it also could be used as a way to basically say goodbye to the deal itself. It's hedging bets a little bit, but it's also signaling that we're not going to be beholden to a one-way relationship where we are completely at the mercy of the United States car market anymore. We are. 80 to 90% of our vehicles go to the United States, and it's going to be very difficult for us to get out of this. But, if we can balance things off a little bit, it would make a big difference. The one more point that I would make about this is that, a lot of Canadians probably don't realize that between 1900 and 1965, Canadians were building cars, but the cars that Canadians built were almost entirely for the Canadian car market or for export markets outside of North America. We were still sending cars to, Australia, New Zealand, other places in the world. From 1900 to 1965, Canadians didn't really send cars across the border to the United States. So, we've gone from going no sales to the United States to almost entirely sales to the United States to now we can see a world where maybe there's going to be a more balanced approach where we're going to sell some cars outside of the United States as well.
Let's end on kind of a bigger picture here. As someone who has studied this industry's history and seen its ups and downs, I'm just curious, is there hope here for the Canadian auto sector? Do you see a path forward to Canada's auto sector, particularly if we're kind of moving away from the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely, I do. I think if there's anything I've learned in studying the Canadian auto industry over the last 120, 130 years, is that it's incredibly resilient and adaptable. I mean, we went through a period in the late 19th and early 20th century where it was a kind of high tariff world to one that was much more multilateral, one that was then continental through the Auto Pact, one that was much more global. Situations change on the ground, and we have tried to adapt to those situations. The Chinese EV deal is an attempt to adapt to the latest situation, and I have no doubt whatsoever that the Canadian auto industry will respond and that we'll continue to build cars in Canada and vehicles in Canada for the future because it makes a lot of sense to do so, and we're pretty good at it. That's the one thing that we've proven over the last century when it comes to the automobile industry.
Dimitry, love to end on a piece of hope here. So thanks so much for joining us. I learned a lot today. Thank you.
My pleasure, Cheryl. Great to be here.
That was Dimitry Anastakis, a professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of History and the Rotman School of Management. That's it for today. I'm Cheryl Sutherland. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. Our editor is David Crosby. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening.